When we think of the Battle of the Bulge, images of snow-covered forests, desperate fighting in the Ardennes, and the encircled American defenders of Bastogne typically come to mind. This massive German offensive, launched in December 1944, has been extensively documented, from its ground operations to the dramatic aerial battles that followed. However, one critical dimension of this campaign remains largely overlooked in popular histories: the devastating V-weapon offensive that rained terror from the skies onto Belgian cities, particularly Antwerp. This aerial campaign was not some peripheral sideshow. It was an integral part of Hitler's grand strategy to capture Antwerp, cripple Allied logistics, and potentially change the course of the war in Western Europe. The story of how German V-1 flying bombs and V-2 ballistic missiles transformed Antwerp into what became known as the City of Sudden Death deserves far more attention than it has received. To understand why Germany launched such an intensive V-weapon campaign against Antwerp, we must first appreciate the city's strategic significance to the Allied war effort. By late 1944, the Allies faced a critical logistics challenge. Their spectacular advance across France following the Normandy landings had completely outpaced their supply lines. Armies that had landed on the beaches of Normandy in June were now operating hundreds of miles inland, creating an enormous strain on logistics. The Allies attempted to compensate through improvised measures like the Red Ball Express, massive truck convoys that hauled supplies from the Normandy beaches to forward units. However, these expedients could only do so much. What the Allies desperately needed was a major port facility close to their advancing armies in northwestern Europe. When British forces captured Antwerp on September 4, 1944, it seemed like the answer to their prayers. Unlike previously captured ports such as Cherbourg and Le Havre, which the Germans had systematically destroyed before surrendering, Antwerp fell almost intact. Its modern port facilities, if brought into full operation, could handle the massive volume of supplies needed to sustain the Allied advance into Germany. However, significant obstacles remained. The Scheldt estuary, Antwerp's water approach from the North Sea, remained in German hands. British and Canadian forces had to conduct difficult amphibious operations throughout October and early November to clear these approaches. The island fortress of Walcheren, the main German strongpoint blocking access to Antwerp, fell only on November 8, 1944, after bitter fighting. The first Allied supply ship finally unloaded at Antwerp on November 28, 1944. For Hitler and his military planners, this development was unacceptable. Antwerp represented the key to continued Allied offensive operations. If Germany could capture or neutralize this vital port, the Allied advance might stall, buying time for Germany to rebuild its forces or negotiate a more favorable peace. Hitler's response to Antwerp becoming operational was characteristically bold and multifaceted. He conceived a two-pronged strategy to neutralize this critical Allied asset. The first prong was the ground offensive through the Ardennes, aimed at breaking through Allied lines, driving to the coast and capturing Antwerp itself. This would divide American and British forces and precipitate a supply crisis that could halt the Allied advance for months. The second prong involved Germany's most advanced weapons, the V-1 flying bomb and the V-2 ballistic missile. These weapons, already being used against targets in England, would now be redirected to support the Ardennes offensive by bombarding Antwerp and other Belgian cities, particularly Liege, another important Allied communications and supply hub. Before examining their use against Belgium, it's worth understanding what made these weapons so formidable and terrifying. The V1, officially designated Phi 103 and commonly called the buzz bomb or doodle bug by the British, was essentially an early cruise missile. It was launched from ramps or dropped from aircraft and flew on autopilot toward its target. The distinctive pulse jet engine produced a characteristic buzzing sound that gave the weapon its nickname. Against England, V1 South launched between June 1944 and March 1945, killed 6,184 people, and injured another 17,900. The damage to British infrastructure was staggering. Approximately 1 million buildings were destroyed or damaged. The psychological impact was considerable, though the V1 had limitations. It was relatively slow, flying at speeds that allowed Allied fighters to intercept it, and anti-aircraft guns could shoot it down with reasonable success. The V2 was an entirely different proposition. This was the world's first operational ballistic missile, a genuine technological marvel that would revolutionize warfare and eventually launch humanity into the space age. Standing 14 meters tall and weighing 12.5 tons with a 1-ton warhead, the V2 represented a quantum leap in military technology. What made the V2 truly terrifying was its speed. It traveled faster than sound, which meant its victims heard no warning before impact. The first sound would be the explosion itself. This characteristic earned it the nickname, the missile of sudden death. The weapon's supersonic approach made it impossible to intercept with existing technology. No fighter could catch it. No anti-aircraft gun could shoot it down. Between September 1944 and March 1945, V2 South launched against England killed 2,754 people and injured over 6,000. The worst single incident occurred on November 25, 1944, when a V2 struck Woolworth's department store in New Cross, South London, killing 168 people and injuring 123 others. The psychological impact on the British public and government was profound. The V2 also achieved several historic firsts. On October 3, 1942, a test rocket reached the edge of space at an altitude of 85 to 90 kilometers. Then, on June 20, 1944, a vertically launched V2 reached 176 kilometers above Earth, well into modern definitions of space. This achievement marked the beginning of space flight and exploration, though such considerations were secondary to the weapon's primary purpose, raining death on enemy cities. The V2's guidance system was not sophisticated enough to target individual buildings, but it could strike large urban areas with reasonable accuracy. Its range of approximately 320 kilometers meant that launch sites in the occupied Netherlands and Western Germany could easily reach targets throughout Belgium and southeastern England. Hitler immediately ordered V-weapon attacks against Antwerp even before the port became fully operational. The campaign began in early October 1944 and would continue for 6 relentless months. While V-1 flying bombs were used extensively, German commanders considered the V-2 the more effective weapon for this campaign, given its immunity to interception. The first V-2 to hit Antwerp was actually a missile that had been aimed at Maastricht, but went off course, striking the city on October 7, 1944. It landed about 8 kilometers from the center without causing casualties. This errant shot was merely the opening note in a symphony of destruction. The first V-2 deliberately aimed at Antwerp struck on October 13th, causing extensive damage. More missiles quickly followed. 5-to-1 flying bombs joined the assault starting October 11th, with the campaign ramping up by October 21st. Brussels and Ghent also came under attack. In just 4 days, 55 V-1 South hit Brussels. By the end of October, 337 V-1 South had struck Antwerp, causing extensive damage and spreading fear throughout the population. The operational setup for this campaign was complex. V-2 units launching against London operated from the area around The Hague in the occupied Netherlands. Additional V-2 batteries in northwestern Germany targeted Antwerp, while other units positioned behind the Ardennes region bombarded Liège. This multi-directional threat made defense exceptionally difficult. As October progressed, the attacks intensified. On October 19th, a V-2 destroyed 25 homes in Antwerp, killing 44 people and injuring over 100. Throughout November, as Hitler finalized plans for his Ardennes ground offensive, the bombardment continued relentlessly. 6 separate V-2 strikes that month killed over 30 civilians each. On November 11th, a V-2 killed 51 people, including 6 Allied soldiers. The missiles struck residential areas, public buildings, and infrastructure with terrible randomness. Then came one of the campaign's most devastating strikes. On November 27th, a V-2 hit Tienersplatz, a large square near Antwerp's central station. This was one of the busiest areas in the city, where roads heavily used by American and British supply convoys converged. The missile struck at 10:12 in the afternoon, catching a British Army convoy in the square. 126 people died, including 26 British and American soldiers. Another 309 were injured. The danger became so acute that Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force ordered ammunition ships to unload at Cherbourg and Le Havre instead of Antwerp. The risk of a V-weapon strike on a fully loaded ammunition ship was simply too great. Such an explosion could have devastated the entire port facility. This was precisely what the Allies could least afford as they worked to alleviate the supply crisis at the front. The V-2 strikes also disrupted rail and barge traffic throughout the region. Railway lines sustained repeated damage, complicating logistics even when the port itself remained operational. Then came December 16, 1944. In the early morning hours, German forces launched their massive offensive through the Ardennes. That same afternoon, at 3:20 p.m., a V-2 struck the Rex Cinema in Antwerp. Seeking a few hours of escape from the war, the missile obliterated the cinema and 10 surrounding buildings. 567 people died, instantly Allied soldiers and Belgian civilians together. Another 291 were injured. This tragedy ranks among the deadliest single V-weapon strikes of the entire war. The Rex Cinema disaster prompted authorities to ban public gatherings of more than 50 people for the duration of the campaign. The psychological impact was immense. Antwerp truly had become the city of sudden death, where any moment, anywhere, might be your last. By the end of 1944, the statistics told a grim story. Antwerp had suffered 590 direct V-weapon hits that destroyed 884 homes completely. Another 6,000 buildings were badly damaged, with 23,000 more suffering lesser damage. The human cost stood at 1,736 killed and 4,000 injured. Despite this punishment, the port continued operating. Most missiles missed the port facilities, landing instead in residential or commercial areas. The German ground offensive, meanwhile, had failed to get anywhere near Antwerp. German spearheads briefly reached the Meuse River before Allied forces progressively pushed them back throughout January 1945. Hitler, however, refused to abandon his strategy. The V-weapon campaign continued as he attempted to reinvigorate the ground offensive in the new year. On New Year's Day, 1945, a V-2 killed 46 people. A V-1 followed, and by January 2nd, 20 more V-1 South had struck the city. On January 8th, a V-2 finally hit the harbor itself, damaging a British freighter. A week later, another V-2 struck the docks, damaging another supply ship and the quay. In total, V-weapons damaged 17 Allied ships during this period. Railway marshalling yards and petroleum installations also took hits. Yet critically, the port was never shut down. It was disrupted, certainly, and operations were complicated by the constant danger. But supplies continued flowing to Allied armies at the front, sustaining the operations that would ultimately crush the Ardennes offensive and continue the advance into Germany. The V-weapon campaign against Antwerp finally ended in March 1945, as advancing Allied forces overran the launch sites. The final accounting was sobering. The city had been struck by 850 V-1 South and V-2 South, with another 1,300 falling in outlying districts. The weapons killed 3,400 Belgian civilians and 700 Allied service personnel. 90,000 properties were destroyed or damaged to various degrees. During the 6-month campaign, there had been only 12 days when no bombs fell on Antwerp. For half a year, the city's residents lived under a shadow of random death that could strike at any moment without warning. Did the V-weapon campaign achieve its strategic objectives? The answer is complex. The bombardment certainly disrupted supply operations, particularly during the critical early phase of the Battle of the Bulge. It forced the Allies to redirect substantial anti-aircraft resources to defend against V-1 flying bombs. Though nothing could stop the V-2 South, the decision to divert ammunition ships to other ports reduced Antwerp's effectiveness as a supply hub. However, the campaign ultimately failed in its primary objective. It did not shut down the port, nor did it materially affect the Allies' ability to defeat the Ardennes offensive. The German ground forces never came close to capturing Antwerp. By late January 1945, the offensive had been decisively defeated, and Allied forces were preparing to continue their advance into Germany. Yet the human cost was staggering. Over 4,000 people died in Antwerp alone, with thousands more injured. Entire neighborhoods were devastated. The psychological trauma inflicted on the civilian population was immense. For those who lived through it, Antwerp's bombardment was as terrifying and destructive as anything experienced in the war. The V-weapon campaign against Belgium also demonstrated the terrifying potential of missile warfare. London, Antwerp, and Liege became guinea pigs for an entirely new form of warfare, one where cities could be struck without warning by weapons traveling faster than sound, launched from positions far beyond the reach of conventional military forces. The V-2, in particular, pointed toward the future. Within 2 decades, similar missiles would carry nuclear warheads, making the V-2's 1-ton conventional warhead seem almost quaint by comparison. The same technology that terrorized Antwerp and London would eventually launch humans to the moon and satellites into orbit. Today, when we remember the Battle of the Bulge, we think of Bastogne, of Patton's relief column, of the brutal winter fighting in the forests of the Ardennes. These stories deserve their place in history. But we should also remember Antwerp, the city of sudden death, where thousands of Belgian civilians and Allied soldiers died under a rain of missiles and flying bombs. This was not a peripheral campaign or a minor footnote. It was an integral part of Hitler's strategy to recapture the initiative in the West. It demonstrated the changing nature of warfare and the terrible power of emerging technologies. And it inflicted suffering on a scale that deserves to be remembered alongside the more famous battles of those desperate winter months. The V-weapon offensive against Antwerp and Belgium represents a forgotten chapter of the Battle of the Bulge, but one that reveals important truths about the nature of that campaign and about the war itself. In the city squares and residential streets where V-2 missiles fell without warning, the future of warfare arrived ahead of schedule, bringing sudden death from the skies and ushering in an age where no city, no matter how far from the front lines, could consider itself truly safe.